There are two ways to update the database: interactively through the transaction object using its screen, or through code. To update through code, there are two options: using the business component of the transaction through its methods, or exclusively within a procedure through the new for each commands with direct assignment of the attributes to be modified, and the delete command. As we know, both options control the uniqueness of records. That is, no records with a repeated primary or candidate key are ever allowed to be left in the database. In the example, it'll never be possible to have two attractions with the same identifier. And if, for example, attraction name were a candidate key, no two attractions with the same name would be allowed either. There's a big difference between updating via a business component and doing it via direct update commands in a procedure. Only business components will execute the logic coming from the rules and events of the transaction. And only in this way will referential integrity be controlled through a program. Why is it that we say through a program? If we have the attraction transaction that records the tourist attractions that always belong to a country and city and to some category, like monument, museum, and so on, then clearly in the associated table, we'll have foreign keys. In particular, the category ID attribute will be a foreign key to the category table. The Genexus developer will not have to program in the transaction the referential integrity control for each foreign key, because it will already be automatically included in the generated program. It's part of the transaction's logic. So, when the user wants to assign an existing attraction to a non-existent category, the transaction informs us that this is not possible. It's making a referential integrity control before the database itself does it. Let's suppose that we implemented a web panel that allows the user to enter an attraction ID and a category ID. To change the category of the attraction to this other one. There are two options to do it through code. One is through the attraction business component, and the other will be through a procedure. Let's see how we would implement the first one. With the business component property activated, we define a variable of this type. And in the event associated with the button, we load it from the attraction ID variable that the user enters through the screen. If it exists, that is, the load does not fail, then we change the category for the one entered by the user and try to update it. This will work just like the transaction, since the code associated with that update method will check for the existence of that category, and only then send the update order to the database. And since that code will find that there is no such category, it will not try to update the database. It will return false, and the else will be executed. Let's try it at runtime. On the other hand, if we want to do the same update through a procedure, as we can see here, we send the attraction and category identifier to this procedure. And in it, we search for the attraction, and the category is directly updated. When we run it with a non-existent category, ouch, a database exception will occur, and the user will have to deal with this unfriendly screen. Here, the program is not performing the necessary referential integrity controls, but the database is making them. This is the reason for this error. We could capture the error to make something more friendly so that the program doesn't cancel abruptly. To this end, the error handler rule is used. As a parameter, we must enter the name of a subroutine that we must define in the object, and there we'll program its behavior in case of a database error, asking first for that error. You can see details about this in our wiki. We can also remove the referential integrity statements from the database, so that it doesn't make the controls. Although this isn't recommended, we have this property at the data store level in case we need it. By default then, if we don't change that property, the referential integrity may or may not be controlled programmatically, but it'll always be controlled by the database. However, we had seen a case where a non-existent foreign key value was allowed. It's just that, strictly speaking, it wasn't a value. That's when we allowed the foreign key to be null. How did we tell the database that we would allow this for a foreign key? In the transaction structure, we had the nullable column, which was set to no by default, but could be changed to yes. This meant that when the transaction was executed, and the category identifier was left empty, the program didn't make any referential integrity controls, and neither did the database. However, if we try to do the same thing, but through the business component, ouch. It's giving us basically the same database exception as before for reference integrity failure. What's going on? Why was it possible to use the transaction but not its business component? The empty value and the null value are two very different things. The empty value is a value. Depending on the data type, it'll be one of the possible values of that type. Thus, if the type is numeric, the empty value is 0. Databases have empty values specified according to each data type. But, strictly speaking, the null value is not a value. In fact, it's a non-value. Saying that category ID is null is the same thing as saying that its value is not specified and is not known. It's not the same as saying it's empty. Therefore, empty and null values are two very different things in databases. If we're implementing a program, and we send the order to change the category of attraction 2 to 0 in the database, what we'll get is none other than the screen with the database exception for referential integrity failure. On the other hand, if we change it to null, there will be no problem, just like when we did it through the transaction. So the question is, why is the transaction asking the database to change the null, and instead the business component is sending the empty value 0? In the properties of the foreign key attribute, category ID, we see one called Nulls in Forms that is set to empty as null. This means that if the attribute accepts nulls, as in this case, every time the value is left empty in the form, it'll be considered to be null when sent to the database and not empty. But this doesn't apply when the update is made through the business component, which does not have a form. Therefore, if the category ID variable is empty, this element will be left with an empty and not null value. And this is why the referential integrity fails when trying to update. We have to specify the null value if the variable is empty. There are two ways to do this. Either we do it locally, only here, or we do the same mapping that gets the attribute property, but this time also valid in the business component, wherever it's used. For the first thing, we only have to specify that if the category ID variable is empty, the business component element will be set to null. The setNull method applies to attributes that accept null values and the corresponding ones in the business component variables, as in this case. If we try it now, we see that we can do it. The drawback of this option is that if we want to leave this foreign key null through a business component variable anywhere else, we'll have to do the same. Like we were saying, the other, more general option is to incorporate the set null as a rule in the transaction. Here, we'll remove it then. And we go to the transaction to specify that the attribute is set to null when its value is left empty. This is already done by default when using the transaction screen thanks to this property. So, strictly speaking, we can ask that this rule is only executed for the business component. We can always indicate that a rule is only executed when it's in the web transaction, or when it's in the business component by placing this mark. Actually, if we want to write a set of rules that only apply to the web transaction, or that only apply to the business component, we can do it in this way. Let's try it. And we see that it is indeed another solution. Finally, what about updating through the procedure? We have exactly the same problem. The solution here can only be the local one. Let's try it. And we see that it works.